Charlie.
Hi.
So I think this might be more of a point of clarification than a legitimate disagreement. So you started off your talk by saying that you oppose science insofar as it stands in the way of nature or it sort of rewrites nature, right? Is that like an accurate representation of your point? Or
It can cause a lot of damage, and not done under the proper moral framework. It's been one of the great killers of modern humanity. Obvious with, there's been phenomenal breakthroughs in modern medicine, but continue with your question. So.
That was actually my question, actually.
Oh, okay, well, there you go.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you could take, for example, so let's kind of just go back to how science is administered through things that we take for granted, right? So, for example, Sir Isaac Newton, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. An object at rest will stay at rest. For every action is equal and opposite reaction, right? He was a phenomenal Christian, wrote a lot about biblical prophecy, and looked at nature as a way to explore God's creation for an intended purpose. And so it's all a question of what is the intent, right? So I'll give you a great example. If the intent is to allow human beings to flourish, then I'm all for it. What's an example of that? How about a cesarean section? What an awesome medical breakthrough over the last 100 years. A cesarean section is, of course, a C-section. Without getting too graphic, it's a way through medical intervention and progress to save human life with that intended purpose. Now, obviously, you have to have an incision. You have to be able to, have the proper medication so that, the woman doesn't feel it. It's the most common medical procedure now done in America today. And so I'm all for scientific breakthroughs and progress, but that's with the intent of saving a human life, right? Properly administered, a C-section is life-giving, right? When you look at other things, there is no life-giving nature to abortion. So you look at two very complex surgical procedures. One's an abortion, one's a cesarean section. Both require a doctor, they require, medication, they require breakthroughs, but they have two completely different moral premises. One to give life and one to take life away. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And speaking of abortion, I did have a sort of separate question,
Sure.
if you don't mind. Yeah. So you sort of touched on abortion from a moral or philosophical standpoint in your talk. From a political or cultural standpoint, how do you see the debate playing out in the mid to long term? Who do you think wins in the long term?
That's a smart question. I've given this advice to conservatives, which is you have to be realistic about it. In certain states, in certain areas, it's not a winning issue. Maybe in a longer period of time, we could do our work and we could persuade people. But if you're trying to get political power or win an election, you got to be realistic about whether or not you think that is going to win people over. And so some people say, Charlie, you should talk about the issue all the time. Well, then how are you ever going to get political power to actually fix the issue, right? At some point, you got to be prudent about this. But I think the left is going to see a surge of support. I think that's going to happen. They're going to see a lot of money come in, a lot more activists. And then I think we as pro-lifers are going to get reorganized, see where we have to go. And I think we have to go on a multi-decade, multi-generation tour, campaign, project of getting into the deep moral and philosophy of it, entertaining questions, doing events. Because here's the one thing I could tell you is that most people that are pro-abortion have really not heard the best defense of life from a moral standpoint, a biological standpoint, and a scientific standpoint. But it's going to be a battle, man. And I think you're going to end up seeing kind of red state, blue state abortion centers across the country where California is poised to make abortion a constitutional right. And you're going to see a lot of that kind of interstate travel and all that kind of stuff. So that's my prediction. Thank you.
Thank you.